Hey, can I chime in quickly on the Carolina Panthers firing of Ron Rivera?
You certainly can.
Okay. Was a little bit surprised by the timing, although
Sure.
I do find it kind of interesting that they lose at home versus the Washington Redskins, who also don't happen to have a head coach at this point in time. And so maybe that got David Tepper thinking, I mean, if they can beat us without a head coach, why am I employing this head coach, right? And so maybe that was some of the logic to it. But one thing that I can assure you of being a part of organizations and just different ownership is every owner, whether they have hands-on or not within an organization, they really want to set the culture. And I think, in the NFL, even though they're pretty far removed from actual being out there on the field where results are made, they still have a huge impact on the culture of that organization and that environment that they create. And so I think this is probably an example of David Tepper wanting to say that, look, that's not good enough. Like, we defend our home field advantage. We don't lose to a team that has basically been a doormat for most teams this year and doesn't even have their head coach. And, I just think he wanted to kind of put his foot down and say, I'm not going to allow that to happen moving forward. So bottom line, it may have been surprising to some people. It kind of was to me for some degree, but I think when I thought about it a little bit more and just from my experience being around different teams with different ownership, you can understand that, like, clearly now that he's taken over as a majority owner, he wants to act quickly to build this thing back up to where I think he thinks it should be. He was a part of the Pittsburgh Steelers beforehand. The irony to that is Jimmy Haslam, who was a minority owner with the Pittsburgh Steelers before he took over as majority owner of the Browns. If you look at very early on when he took over the Browns, they made very quick, decisive decisions, not necessarily good decisions, but still that's something you tend to see out of young owners. They're making very, very quick decisions. They tend not to be patient. They tend not to, take a while to make these sorts of decisions. So that was just kind of a couple of things that stuck out to me.
Yeah, plus these owners usually come into the situation having made billions of dollars. They're used to being the head, the big cheese or whatever, and they're used to having things go their way. And clearly things haven't gone their way for the Panthers. So I want to ask you a few things, Brady. Tepper released a statement. In that statement, he said they're also going to hire an assistant GM and an assistant director of operations. If you're Marty Hurney, what are you thinking? And if you're Cam Newton, what are you thinking as they spin this thing forward?
If you're Marty Hurney, I mean, here's the predicament you're in. Either you're now going to be a part of an organization where you don't really probably have the final say in the roster, and it's usually a joint decision, but ultimately the buck stops at somewhere, and it's usually the general manager for the roster decision. So if that's the case, you're sharing that responsibility. You're basically being set up to be the fall guy, right? Because you're the expendable one. They're just bringing on someone else who David Tepper can rely on, and eventually they're going to move on from you. Not a good spot to be in. And so if I was him right now, I'd just basically say, okay, why don't you let me go ahead and move on too. He's been in Charlotte for a long time. I'm sure Will can speak more to that, but maybe he doesn't want to move on to another organization and be with another team. Or maybe he doesn't mind having to share the responsibility and potentially the blame if things don't work out. But that's how I would view it. Like, if I was in his shoes, I'd probably want to look to go find work elsewhere, unless it's just a lifestyle decision and I want to stay in Charlotte like he did over the period of time where he left the Panthers and then eventually came back. As far as what it means for Cam Newton, it's not a good sign. Again, I think with an owner, when you talk about trying to set the culture of your organization, you also want to bring in your own head coach. And when you want to bring in your own head coach, he wants to bring in his own quarterback. So I would imagine that even though Cam's on an economical deal, they're probably going to want to move on from him. They'd probably look to draft one somewhere high next year to come in and kind of be the guy moving forward. Kyle Allen played well this year. I'm sure him and Will Grier can help create some depth there behind whoever the starter is next year. But for me, it's going to be someone that they end up taking in next year's draft. And I think, look, Cam Newton's going to be the starter next year. I don't think it's going to be with the Carolina Panthers.
Yeah, I think that they'll probably trade him. They could cut him depending on, it all depends on his medical situation really with Cam, but I think a trade could certainly work out and be like, and if they decide, if they decide to move on from Marty Hurney, it also makes sense to me to move on from Cam Newton because you get sort of a clean break for the whole organization, hit the reset button. It's something I've been talking about since really the preseason. Like if this year didn't work out for Carolina, it felt like that's the direction they were heading in. I'd be curious, Brady, what do you think? I floated this on the podcast, and not that Ryan follows the college game closely, but from a draft perspective, I know you talk to these coaches all the time. Two names that stood out to me, and I know one of them you're going to laugh at, and the other I think you might think is interesting, but I'm curious if you would add more to him. Matt Rule out of Baylor, who took when he took over, they were 1-11 his first year. They're 11-1 now. They could easily be going to the college football playoff had they held on and beaten Oklahoma a few weeks ago. They're going to get a chance to redeem themselves in the Big 12 championship game. He flirted with the Jets last year. The Jets tried to make him hire who they wanted on his coaching staff, and he wisely said no dice. Then they hired your boy Goose. And then the other, Dabo Swinney. I know that's a crapshoot, but he's local. He is maybe he wants to shot at the NFL. And maybe David Tepper would give him the run of things. Do you think either of those college coaches is viable? And if not, or if so, would you add any names to the list from the college ranks?
Matt Rule, definitely. I think he kind of comes from an NFL background to start off with. So, there's some sort of desire there. And I think you look at the way he built up programs, what a Temple before he ends up going to Baylor. And there's a lot of respect there. I think a lot of people look at him as, truly a coach, truly a leader who can come in and kind of reshape a program. I mean, think about what Baylor was when he took over for Art Briles. I mean, that was a one-win football team. It was an absolute disaster. And in just a few years' time, he's been able to make it into a team that's right now in the top 10. So there's a lot of teams looking at him. The Carolina Panthers are going to have competition for him. It could very well be the Dallas Cowboys if they move on from Jason Garrett. It could very well be the New York Giants if they move on from Pat Shurmur. I would assume even the Washington Redskins have put out some feelers, although the toughest part is going to be coaching for Daniel Snyder, which, again, I think, the Carolina Panthers, Giants, Cowboys, presumably in this scenario, would all be better places to work as opposed to the Washington Redskins. So he's definitely a candidate that I would throw into the mix for that. As far as anyone else out there that's currently coaching, I couldn't see Dabo. I really couldn't. I think he's got a good thing going right now. It'd be hard to leave that program with where it's at and how he's got it rolling. At least stay for another year with Trevor Lawrence, try to go win another potential national championship. They may very well win it this year with as good as they are and as loaded as they are. And I wouldn't, he might want to test the waters at some point. I would just be curious to see how things would translate over from a scheme perspective for him. The NFL game is so much about matchups, so much about scheme. You've really got to be one of the best X and O's minds, I think, to really excel at that level. And so much of college football is about recruiting and leadership and being able to manage people. And I think those things are still applicable at the NFL level, but there's still got to be a fair amount of understanding when your offensive coordinator or when your defensive coordinator is messing up, and when you've got to kind of step in and consult and step in and do that, even if you're in a more managerial role as a head coach, if you know what I'm saying. Nick Saban, maybe you want to try to throw a bunch of money at him, see if he is tired of dealing with recruiting and everything that comes along with that. Things didn't work out in Miami. Maybe he'd give Carolina a try. Urban Meyer's out there. He's one of my coworkers. I'm sure there's a lot of other guys who've been incredibly successful at the college ranks that maybe you want to fish around for and see. And that probably plays into the fact that, and Pete Prisco and I were talking about this earlier on HQ, there's not a lot of coordinators you look at and say, man, that guy should be the next head coach of X team, right? Josh McDaniels is one, but he's been a former head coach. Outside of that, maybe Matt Eberflus, the defensive coordinator for the Colts. He's done a really good job during his time there with Frank Reich. He'd be a guy that kind of sticks out to me, at least, someone that people could talk about. Outside of him, I'm not sure, unless you're talking about retreading another coach that maybe just got fired. Maybe Jason Garrett, guy's never had a losing season in his career, unless this year would happen to be that. Maybe that's a guy you'd want to look, at least as far as having a starter and so forth. But there's a number of names out there. I just don't know that there's anyone that really kind of sweeps you away and says, that's the guy. We have to go out and get that guy outside of potentially a Josh McDaniels.
Brady, two names that maybe will be looked into. We don't know if they're going to be home runs or not. Kevin Stefanski and Robert Saleh, Vikings OC and 49ers DC. But I wanted to ask you this, because you mentioned in passing Nick Saban, and Brinson mentioned him on the Emergency podcast. Why would Nick Saban, why would Dabo Swinney, why would Lincoln Riley leave their super plum gigs to go to the hardcore, rigorous, have to win no matter what NFL? And we saw what happened when Nick Saban wasn't able to recruit with the Miami Dolphins. The first thing he did was take Dante Culpepper over an injured Drew Brees, and that obviously didn't work out. He didn't last long. Bobby Petrino is actually another example of a guy who just didn't work out. Is there any incentive for a college coach who is wildly successful to leave that cush setup to go to the NFL?
Yeah, more money. I mean, you can get paid more at the NFL level, and so that's the biggest thing is do you want more money? Do you need more money? Do you want to try it again? I think the toughest thing for college football head coach who's got it very, very well established one in the NFL is you've got it all. I mean, you're probably the most highest paid state employee, in whatever state you want to talk about, right? Like you probably can dictate whatever you want from a recruiting standpoint, your facilities, everything else. There's not many people you answer to. Like, you can say it's the athletic director, but like let's check your pay stub. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're getting paid more than the athletic director. You're getting paid more than the president. And so you've got a lot more control, in particular with big money boosters. And I'm sure with many high-ranking officials within the state government or the local government there that even your president and athletic director does. So, you'd be sacrificing and giving up all that control that you have for taking over an opportunity where you could get paid more and you don't have to recruit. I mean, as much as you want to talk about the grind of an NFL, season, I mean, come on, man. All these guys are working now. They don't have to go to class. You don't have to worry about following them around and making sure they're getting papers done and so forth, or constantly recruiting, because that's a never-ending deal. Because if you're not recruiting for next year, you're recruiting for 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line, and so that never stops. The NFL is a grind. There's no doubt about it, but there's also a lot of things that are put in place to help you focus solely on football, not all the other things like boosters and the different things that come along with being a head football coach at the college football level. So there's some things that are enticing. They're two different games, though. I mean, that's the thing, is talent's more equated at the NFL level. Everyone's great. Everyone's a good football player. There's good, really good, and there's great players, and those players usually move on to be Hall of Famers or a small percentage. But that's what you get at the NFL levels, and then it comes down to scheme and matchups. And that's where, again, I keep, harking back to, you have to be an X's and O's guy. You have to be dominant there, because that will get tested at the NFL level. And if you're just one of those guys who kind of manages it all, or you really relied on recruiting and your assistants to do a good job, if your staff stinks, you're going to struggle at the next level.
And look, Dabo Swinney, he hadn't lost since 2017. I mean, like, I'm just throwing it out there as a, like, I think he would at least be, I think any coach, any person in a profession would be enticed by the idea of winning at the highest possible level. I don't think he would leave. I'm just saying, throw it out there.